Okay, good evening everyone, and welcome to the Princeton Public Library. My name is Janie Herman, and I'm the manager of adult programming. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone here to the library tonight, both in person in our community room and virtually on YouTube. I'll be your host and moderator for tonight's panel discussion on Toni Morrison's Sites of Memory, the making of an exhibit. Before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping notes. Please note that this room is equipped with a hearing loop that pairs with T-coil technology. If you need hearing assistance, T-coil enabled headphones are available for use. Just raise your hand and we'll bring you some headphones. We kindly ask that you, of course, silence your electronic devices and hold questions till the end, and if you have, we'll do a Q&A at the end of the session. So tonight's event is being held in partnership with Princeton University and in specific, the Princeton University Libraries. The library is grateful to have such a strong and collaborative relationship with Princeton University for so many of our events, including this one tonight, where we will be hearing from Autumn Womack and the rest of the curatorial team for Toni Morrison Sites of Memory. Our panelists will give behind-the-scenes account of the 3 years of research and work that went into the creation of this exhibit that is currently on view at the Ellen and Leonard Milberg Gallery in Firestone Library until June 4th. Here to introduce our speakers is Stephanie Oster. She's the publicity manager for the Princeton University Library and has been deeply involved with this exhibit. So welcome, Stephanie.
Thanks, Janie. Welcome, everyone. As Janie mentioned, I am the publicity manager at Princeton University Library. I'm also a member of the Board of Trustees here at Princeton Public Library, so I am doubly thrilled to be here tonight with you all. So let me introduce the panel. Autumn Womack, right here. Autumn is the lead curator for the exhibit. She's an associate professor of English and African American Studies at Princeton University. She is also the author of The Matter of Black Living, The Aesthetic Experiment of Racial Data, 1880 to 1930, and the editor of the Norton Library edition of Charles Chesnutt's 1901, The Marrow of Tradition. Next to Autumn on her right is Renee Boatman. Renee is an administrative assistant in special collections at Princeton University Library, where she assists in collection development in the promotion of holdings on the subject of African American history and culture. She was Toni Morrison's assistant from 1992 to 2019. To Renee's right is Jennifer Garçon. Jen is the librarian for modern and contemporary special collections at Princeton University Library, where she is responsible for the collection, curation, and care of 20th century and 21st century rare books, manuscripts, and born digital collections, including the Toni Morrison Papers. And finally, Andrew Schlager. Andrew is a writer and a PhD candidate in the Department of English at Princeton University. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jeannie.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for helping set up this panel and for all that you do here at the library for us as a trustee. And it is National Library Week, so this is a great way for us to start National Library Week with a partnership between two libraries and this exhibit focusing on a great American author. So, taking inspiration from her 1986 essay, The Site of Memory, the exhibition brings together select objects from the Toni Morrison Papers, and it has materials that illuminate how her creative process was a deeply archival one, and it also will reveal aspects of her writing life and her writing practices. So I wanted to start the conversation with our panelists by simply asking this. When and how did the idea for this exhibition come about? And maybe Autumn, you want to start us off? And then everybody can just join in? Yeah.
Cool. Thank you guys for being here. And are we here? Is it working?
It's picking it up. Yeah.
Great. So the exhibition really, we started thinking about it in the summer of 2020. And prior to that, so I arrived at Princeton University in 2017 from the University of Pittsburgh. When I was at the University of Pittsburgh, this is a long, winding road, but we get there. It'll be a short road. I taught a class on Toni Morrison, kind of her novels, and I'm a scholar and researcher historically of 19th century African American literature. So for me, teaching a Toni Morrison class was like a breath of fresh air, which I know for those of you who've read her books, that might sound like a paradoxical statement. So I came to Princeton and immediately I wanted to recreate the class, and I wanted to recreate it in relationship to the Toni Morrison Papers, which had just arrived at Princeton a year before I arrived. So I had been teaching the class for about 3 semesters in different iterations when the library started an exhibition program in earnest. And so that summer they approached me, and Gabriel Swift in particular said, hey, I know you've been teaching with the collection. You know the collection probably better than anybody at this point. Would you be interested in curating an exhibition? We were deep in COVID, and I said yes. And by that winter, I had joined forces with these two. There was another graduate student, Kiera Duncan, and another graduate student, Mimi Borders, who were also part of the curatorial team. And then I guess a year later, we had the good fortune of having Jem join Princeton University Library, and so she joined the team. So it was an iterative process. So the idea really came from the teaching, came from the collection, and then it blossomed from there. I don't know if you guys want to add on with your origin stories.
Well, I started with the library pretty quickly after Ms. Morrison passed in the fall of 2019. So I was really on board with the library in January of 2020. And this idea sort of, was floating around about doing an exhibition. The Morrison Papers had opened to the public in 2016.
Yeah.
They had been being processed and for some time before that. And so it seemed like a really, fantastic idea. And like Autumn said, it's in COVID, we're all like at home and thinking, oh my God, what are we gonna do? And it was an opportunity to have a project to work on and to begin to sort of think together about the work. And it was really, really fun, to work with Autumn and some graduate students to begin to think about what was this work, what could we do with it, what was exciting about it. And so it was just a really great opportunity and has proven to be, a really fun project for me personally.
Anybody else?
My first encounter with the Morrison Archives was I arrived to Princeton in 2019, and there was a small memorial exhibit in the lobby, and there was a draft of a page from Beloved where Setha's name was read, and I geeked out over that for a long time. And then the archive disappeared from me, and then when Autumn had, suggested I interview for this job, I was submerged in, and yeah. So I'm, thinking about this now, it's just reminding me of all of the different ways I've seen this archive, like being in person, but then looking at it during COVID on digitized versions. So yeah, it's been a lot of forms.
And I can't quite speak to that early time, having not been at Princeton during the time, but one of the things that I found really kind of interesting and insightful was hearing you all talk about the process of going through the boxes themselves, both going through them in digital form while we were all stuck at home, but then kind of the physical materiality of going through almost 400 boxes, all of the folders, and in some ways, a lot of the pages, if not all of the pages that encompass this collection, and that being kind of part of the kind of curatorial vein, kind of the labor and the intention of doing that work. And so I was always really excited to have come on board and then get to kind of hear what that process was like, not having had the good fortune to kind of be in the stacks with you guys during that really kind of rigorous period.
Yeah, when that kind of... So that brings me to my next question here, and I'm going to imagine, Renee, you probably had known the most, but what did each of you know about the existing papers when each of you started in at your, working on the project at whatever stage that was? So you're curating this exhibit, you knew there were hundreds of boxes. What were your expectations of what you might find? And did you encounter any surprises as you were going through, especially in those early days of trying to curate the exhibit? And what did you know about those boxes that you were sifting through?
Sure.
Well, I will just say, since I was working with Professor Morrison for a lot of years, I was sort of in charge of these papers for many years. There was some stuff at her house, there was stuff at the office, and once the process, well, early on, as you know, there was a large fire at her home, which damaged a lot of materials. That was in December of '93. And the library offered to come and rescue some of that stuff and conserve it. So it had been on deposit at the library since that time, that material. And then as agreements were made about the rest of it, you know, we started transferring material over. So I knew, you know, I'd seen a lot of it, although I will say, you know, going through it like we did, there were things that I had never seen and was completely surprised at finding. And I think for me, you know, I just had a lot of gaps in my understanding of the story, how I had put my story together of working for her over the years. And being able to look at the papers really helped me to sort of fill in some of the things that I didn't quite understand how they fit together. And so that was, for me, very, very satisfying.
I think, so I had some sense of what the collection was like, having taught with it. And so one of the assignments that I gave my students, and I still give it to them, is go into the collection and find an item or items that help us think through the text that we're reading that week. So they might bring in a draft of a page, a handwritten draft of a page of Beloved, right? And then we'll think about that handwritten draft in relationship to the published, excuse me. So I had a sense of what kind of things were in the collection. But I also didn't. And so I remember in our first initial meeting, everybody said, okay, what do you want us to look for, right? What do you want to be in the show? And I said, look for everything and look for nothing, right? I didn't want it to be a show that was organized according to novels, right? So looking for all the background material for each novel, and I didn't want it to be just about drafts, right? I was like, fine, look for anything. And so I think everything in that way was a surprise that we encountered. One of the earliest items that actually one of my students, the first time I taught the class, Rashida Saka, who she should be finishing up at Iowa Writers Workshop. She's an amazing writer. That she found that is now actually on display in the exhibit is a map from a point of view map for the novel Paradise. So I knew that there were things like that, right? Very creative ways that Morrison was working through parts of her creative process and practice. I didn't think I knew the scope of it because I hadn't sat kind of in the company with all of those boxes at once. So there would be times during the summer of 2021 where we were literally surrounded by like 50 boxes, right? And so you're just in the company of that volume of material. And to give you guys a sense, every box includes anywhere between 7 and 40 folders, right? Individual folders that then might have anywhere between 1 and 50 pieces of paper in them. And there are 400. So this is thousands of sheets of paper that include everything from drafts of novels to speeches to business records to correspondence, photographs. There's a ton of stuff. And so even if you think you know what's in a folder, right, it's clearly labeled, there still are surprises buried in there. That's a very long answer to the question, but I think that kind of like everything becomes surprising. And even now, we were, Renee and I were just with my students looking through boxes for the novel Paradise. And I've looked at those folders ad nauseum, hundreds of times. And I'm still seeing new things. So that there's a way in which the same material, because there's so much writing on each page, is a surprise and is new every time. So sometimes it's the same things that are surprising.
I just want to add one thing about what you told us.
Oh.
You said,
Okay.
look for stuff that's interesting
I
to
did say
you.
that.
And then, you know, because I was looking at stuff and thinking, is this important? It all looks important to me. This is important. But then there were things that were interesting. So she really encouraged us to like mark out things that were specifically interesting to us. And I thought that was a really great way to sort of begin to look at something and latch on to something that was interesting to me personally.
What were you surprised by?
Yeah.
I'll say two surprises. One was this was really my first experience sort of working and thinking archivally. And my first impulse was to have published copies of the novels in hand. So I went through the beloved files first, and I would try to, adequate and go back and forth between the final text and the archive. And eventually, I feel like over the course of doing this, what surprised me was how it actually became easier to just like put the published thing aside and treat the material as, sort of sufficient and a sort of invention unto itself. So that was very surprising to feel myself wanting to just let go of what I thought I needed, the final version, and just live with what was mysterious about what was before me. And then in terms of just like, artifact surprises, just watching Morrison transform researched facts into literary language was just, stupefying. And the first time seeing her sort of take research and turn it into something else, imagining it, was just, I couldn't believe that it was like I was seeing that equation happen.
What were you surprised by?
I think I too was really surprised by the volume of research that underlines all of these projects. Some that have been published into kind of the well-known works that we know, others that are still in this kind of research stage, having been unpublished. And that's in large part because I studied Morrison for my master's and was really kind of keyed into the ways in which she incorporated not only just rich historical research, but was thinking about literary forms like Dick and Jane, were really incorporating these other aspects. And thought of that a little bit at the time as I was writing as just happenstance. And I think one of the things that the collection and the papers themselves really illustrate is the ways in which there is so much thought and there's so much intention behind what we then experience as happenstance in the works themselves. And I think it's really interesting to think about the prompt of look for everything and then nothing, because it really illustrates kind of the depth of early archival research, which I feel like really kind of signals the work that you guys have been doing in that early time, right? You were letting the collection tell you what it needed to tell you about the story, that one of the many stories, I'm sure, that the papers in the collection could tell.
Yeah.
And there was a way in which coming to it with kind of this open slate enabled it to do that. And so that was really exciting.
Okay, well, you kind of partly answered my next question. It was about kind of the process of reviewing that entire collection, and I read online that the archive is actually something like 200 linear feet of research materials, manuscripts, drafts, correspondence, photographs, and a whole bunch of ephemera. It sounded like she really kept a lot and everything. And I was going to ask about anything in particular you were looking for, but it sounds like what you were looking for was anything interesting, which I do think is a really great way to do it, because if it was of interest to you, then it would be of interest to the public. And
Yeah, I'll also just add that part of that ethos for me comes from my background doing archival work, and really being trained in a particular kind of archival research, which is all about letting the archive tell you what the story is. And so one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize with this show is the idea that an archive is not always a place that just gives you answers, right? We think of it as okay, I want to know, for example, what was on this site before it was this library, right? You might go into the archive and look at building records or look at maps or something like that, right? Look to get information for a question that you already are asking yourself. But the other part of that that's really important to my own practice is the archive is also a place that invites questions, right? And produces new work and produces new kind of thinking, doesn't just affirm the thinking that we already have. And so that's the ethos that I always move with, I teach with, I write with, and I really wanted that to animate the curatorial practice too. That we're not going into this curation with a predetermined idea about who Toni Morrison is or what the books are about, but instead, what questions does it raise for us about how she worked, how she practiced, what she prioritized, what creative investments were important to her at various moments in her life and career. And that, I think, allowed us to actually curate a much richer show than if it would have just been a show about behind the scenes of Beloved, for example, which, by the way, I think would be a very good show. But
So that's next then.
but it's a different kind of practice and project, I think, of just saying, okay, what questions are being raised for us here, and how can we begin to let this collection give us some answers?
Okay. So yeah, we were going to talk, but I mean, just the sheer volume of it, I think when I read that, I mean, I guess having had such a prolific career, you would expect that, but it's still just, it must have been really daunting to get in there and start looking through that collection. So what was your organization process? Did you divide up a certain amount of boxes, or did all of you go through all of the boxes, or what was the process like?
I remember this very clearly because I've learned also about myself that I'm very type A. I did not know this before. And everyone's like, really? You didn't know? But Stephanie's laughing like, I created spreadsheets that had tabs for every published book, then every other genre of writing, like essays, interviews, nonfiction, other miscellaneous. And then I assigned people books and other categories, drama, poetry, right? This is all stuff that's in the collection. And then I created a color-coded system where they ranked items by what's really important, what's really interesting, what's marginally interesting, what might be interesting, but I'm not sure. And then the location, a summary, and a brief kind of citation. And then we met as a group, this was all online, and did feedback, right? Shared and talked. And what we found in those feedback is actually there were some lines of connections. We were beginning to see what each other was seeing. And then when we got into the collection, we kind of had a preliminary list of what we wanted to go through based on that color-coded list. So that was where we started. And then it all just kind of went in every direction, and my color-coded list never was looked at again. But that was the starting point, which I do think was a good starting point. And then, so we had a map, and then we had a kind of a guide, and then ultimately we just, by the end, just going through every box. So what haven't we looked at, and let's just cross-check to see if things were interesting, and things did pop up that we didn't anticipate. Does that sound?
Yeah, and I would also say too that, you know, as you go through, like you're saying, the archive begins to tell you something. So then there's all these questions about, remember when we talked about this thing and we saw that? Where is that again?
That's when the sheets came and useful.
Yeah, and that's when we went back to that. But things started to sort of, like you say, things started to kind of connect a little bit, and we started to feel like a little traction on these connection nodes. And I think that's kind of, I mean, you may have always known a little bit about how you wanted to divvy it up, but that's when I started to see, oh, okay, this is it is kind of telling us that these are these different kind of groupings of papers and ideas and notions that she had.
And so then, so here's a question. I actually don't want to see these spreadsheets. I love a good spreadsheet.
I do too.
Yeah. As my team will tell me, I have spreadsheets for everything. But so now, do these spreadsheets, this is a question for you, Jen, do these spreadsheets now become a part of her ongoing archive? Because So this is just a regenerative art. Like, so now we have this exhibit. So does the making of this exhibit become now a part of the Toni Morrison archive and all of the work that went into creating this? Or no, am I off base there?
Yeah, it does not in large part because of the way provenance works. But particularly for the exhibits program, this kind of work will be documented and will live on to influence, I think, future exhibitions and thinking about how work process and workflow could work were we to engage these kind of large manuscript collections in another exhibition format.
So Firestone is just kind of undergoing the process of doing more of these exhibits, possibly with your archives?
So the exhibits program has been longstanding, but we recently, the Millbrook Gallery, I think, gave us an opportunity to kind of formalize the exhibits process. And I believe that the Morrison exhibit is maybe the 4th exhibit in that space.
Okay.
And so with the new space,
5 or 6, maybe, 5th or 6th. There's welcome additions in Gutenberg before Piranesi, Alchemy, and then Records of Resistance. So yeah.
Yeah. So it says one of the first really, it's still in its founding of how you're going to be working the exhibits at that
space.
space.
I think that we're still learning the exhibits programs and learning how to operate in a new space. And so I think it will be really insightful to thinking about how we execute exhibits in the future for sure.
Mm-hmm. So I was talking to Stephanie. She told me that the exhibit has about 100 original archival objects, and it is divided into 6 sections. And I went and I looked at this. I didn't realize it was 100. I knew it was a lot, and I knew there was the 6 sections. But can you tell us more about each of the sections, and how did you arrive at this structure? Like, what are the sections, and how did you arrive at the structure of having the exhibit as it is?
It's funny because when you say it's a lot of items, to me, it still feels like not enough. But I was doing a tour today, and this one's like, oh, there's so much. And I was like, the list could have been 3 times this size, and I wanted it to be. But I'm glad it didn't, because then it would have looked a little chaotic. But I knew I wanted it to be interlocking, to be like a constellation, right? And so there was one very early idea of what I knew I didn't want, which was a chronological story of her life. That to me just seemed so off base with Morrison's thinking, which is all about disrupting chronology, right? And to me, that didn't seem like a story that we needed the archive to tell. I think it's a very important story, but it didn't seem to be one that we needed to tell with the archive, right? There could have been another version that was like greatest hits, like the most exciting things. And that to me also didn't seem to be the story that the archive needed to tell. And what we learned from that, from spreadsheet to conversation to in-person, back to spreadsheet to ideas, was that there were all of these ways that there were themes and questions that were stretching across the collection. And by that I mean a question about structure that Toni Morrison might have been working out in relationship to the bluest eye. Like, let's say she was outlining the story in a particular kind of way. You would see a similar outline practice in the files for Paradise, and again in the files for Jazz, and again in the files for God Help the Child. So there was a way that these themes were stretching across the collection. And it just, in my mind, it was always visually a constellation, right? All of these networks that were related but distinct. So I knew I wanted pockets, little rooms that you could move throughout in the exhibition, and where you could begin to see for yourself connections, but also kind of distinct practices. And 6, I think, is because that's all can fit. But some of the themes are beginnings, which tracks some Toni Morrison's kind of early creative pursuits leading up to the publication of The Bluest Eye in 1970. There's a section that thinks about how and where she wrote, called Writing Time. There's a section that homes in on geography and its importance to her practice. So it's looking at the way she used, made hand-drawn maps and outlines and kind of made sketches of blueprints for each novel, or many novels. There's a section called Wandering and Wandering that's about creative process, right? How she worked, what she described as wandering and wandering. There's a section on correspondence called Black Feminist Genealogies, and a section called Speculative Futures, which is kind of outward-looking projects that she started but maybe never finished. And those sections really emerged from our conversations. I remember a really early conversation with Andrew. We were having lunch probably like May of 2021. And I think that's when some of the ideas began to kind of crystallize in that conversation. But they shifted and they moved depending on what we found. When we found the diary entries that contained the only known drafts of Song of Solomon, that became really clear that they needed their own section. And so something cycled out, and that section, which became writing time, cycled in. But it really was the idea of mapping out for visitors what it might feel like to work through the collection yourself, and what you would begin to see is all of these overlapping, interlocking worlds. Yeah.
I feel like, and I would also add, it's like a textual material, and obviously all of us are in various ways involved in like literary criticism or literary studies. And I feel like there was also like sort of, as we developed, or as we began to really have to imagine that this was going to be an exhibit and not a book, that also felt like it fed into how we were going to imagine organizing this. I don't know if that...
Yeah, well, early on, I remember a curator for the museum, Mitra Amaspor, came in, and she was like, this looks like a book, not like an exhibition. She was like, you've got to learn how to tell the story with images. And the challenge is that they were pretty much all two-dimensional. They're all two-dimensional images. And so curating a story with paper only and not books is really hard. I think historically the exhibitions in that space have been book-based. So you have some three-dimensionality, you have some more objects. But I was really committed to just using the Princeton collection and not borrowing a ton of objects. And that meant that they were, with the exception of 2 objects, all single sheets of paper. And so I think the constellation, the 6 pockets, also kind of helps to give some depth and helps kind of guide folks through.
Okay. So here we go. So can each of you just maybe tell me, do you have a favorite item that's in the exhibit?
Oh God. It's like choosing a favorite child.
Is it like choosing a favorite child?
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean, someone else go first. I feel like I'm cheating cheating on the objects.
I think that, I mean, I worked a lot on the beginning section, so I was very fond of some of the early, what Morrison actually called juvenilia, but was probably written when she was in college or at Cornell. And I got very attached. Some of these little short stories that were just, I don't know, that just felt like the more questions you asked of them, the deeper you could go. And then it goes outwards, right? Because then you're thinking about, oh, but what about this in this book? Or what about this thing that she does, or way she thinks about something, that you begin to sort of make the web around the thing that you're interested in and how it radiates outward to her work. And so for me, that I would say some of the short stories were really my favorite, the unpublished short stories.
Maybe this is a slightly not answering the question, but I would say an item that I love because I feel like it just becomes more and more mysterious to me the more I spend time with it, is just the cover and back cover of the first edition of The Bluest Eye.
Interesting.
I feel like every time I go back to that, it becomes less and less clear to me who chose this.
Do you want to describe to them?
The cover of the original cover of The Bluest Eye is just the opening paragraphs of the novel printed, And as Kiara and I have talked about a lot, no word is bigger than any other. The title, Toni Morrison's name, the opening paragraphs, it's all the same text size. And then the back is this like really compositionally strange photo of Morrison, where she's sort of at like a diagonal framed almost. It's like as if she was sort of like maybe like lying down in this photo. It's like this very strangely framed photo. And there's no bio, there's no blurb. There's, at least on the outside cover, there's no sort of like selling points you'd think of for a first-time novelist. And it just becomes, and it's like then I became really interested in the fact that it was this theater photographer who took this photo, and it just becomes more and more unclear to me whose desire this was, what she thought of this. So I do love that item for its becoming unclear.
What's yours? I think I'd say the date planners in section 2. So the date planners are fire singed in large part because they had been badly damaged in the fire in '93. And I think that they're having an interesting kind of multi-layered conversation about ephemerality, materiality, and labor, right? That there's a particular labor that they're documenting in that she is writing where there is time to write, that she is also juggling her writing with her work, considering that she was still an editor at the time. And then the notion that there was also a very concerted effort and labor into making sure that these materials continue to exist after the fire. And so I think that they're telling a really interesting story about archives, but also about kind of the precarity of archives and archival material without concerted collection on the part of the archival creator, but in some ways the kind of institutional support of archivists and conservators. And so I think it's telling a kind of interesting story to see kind of the large expanse, and also to think a little bit about what it looks like if these materials had not existed, what we would not have learned if a different scenario had played out. Do I have to go?
Oh, come on. Must have.
It changes. Every time I give a tour, I have a different favorite one. But I think the material that I had an immediate kind of what you think of as the quintessential archival moment or feeling when you encounter an archival object or in the midst of research and you're just kind of like arrested. And it's archival labor and research is so monotonous, and most of the time it's boring and crazy making, and halfway through, at like an 8-hour sitting, I always just get like an anxious feeling and I have to take a walk, and I've done it a lot and it always feels that way. And then you get a moment where it's revelatory, either because it's something you didn't know existed or because you recognize something of yourself in it, I think. Either a reading practice or a memory or something. It's like that aura. And for me, it was these hand-drawn maps that are in the Paradise folder, which is my favorite Morrison novel. That will never shift. And she drew street maps for Ruby, which is the all-black town that is one part of the central geographic location. The other is the convent, which she also drew maps of. But it was something about these hand-drawn maps of the town that felt such a familiar kind of creative process and practice. As a kid, I mapped out worlds for my dolls and paper dolls. Everybody had a map for where they lived and where they moved, and there was something about creating the worlds from which these imaginative characters might emerge and also in which they dwell that felt to me so familiar. So those remain my favorite. And my sister we drew them together. When she came to the show, she was like, oh my God, these look like our paper doll maps. And I was like, I know. We did not create.
I like the maps.
You did. We had a lot of comments. It's a map to spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Pipeline is very smooth, it seems. Yeah.
I love it when I open a book and there's a map, and especially when it's a world-building kind of book. I need that map sometimes.
A map and a family tree. Now, the thing that's interesting about Morrison, though, is that the maps don't make their way into the book. And in fact, most of the texts are geographically and temporally and familially unwieldy. So there's also something about creating the infrastructure that you then can rise above and move around and mess with, but you need to have it fixed, right? And so often my students are like, I wish there was a family tree for paradise. And I'm like, there is in the research files. And then it gets totally upended.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
I never really thought of it that way. And this is just, so I mentioned earlier, it's the start of National Library Week, and today is Freedom to Read Day, and whether the audience all knows this, but The Bluest Eye, which we were just talking about, has been on the top 10 banned books list for years now. And did she ever, and maybe Renee would know more about this, did she ever have any feelings about The Bluest Eye being one of the most challenged books in America? Did she ever express that, or was it just kind of like...
I don't think she really wanted to get in it, but she would say that, her sister didn't let her children read this book until they were a certain age, and that was her right to do that.
Right.
So,
yeah.
She worked with PEN America and did other things around book banning and stuff like that, but she just didn't ever really get in the conversation about her own books. She kind of felt like that was other people's business to talk about that, not hers.
Interesting. Okay. So let me see. So one thing is, if you go on to the exhibit page on the website, you can see that there's obviously just a lot of excitement and energy around this exhibit that built not only within the library, but in the broader campus and town, and that there were, partnerships with McCarter Theater, the University Art Museum, Princeton University concerts. So how involved were the curatorial team in that, or how did that all come about? Because it's not just, since it opened in March, it's not just been, hey, here's an exhibit. It's, go to the theater, go to the art museum. There was even a whole conference around that. So, how was that? That was a big lift for this team to get this all done. Can you speak about that?
She did all the lifting on that.
Yeah, it was a big lift. So from the beginning, I knew that I wanted to activate it outside of the gallery. One of the things that I knew from having taught with the collection is that it was inviting us to think about all the ways that Toni Morrison, the collection was inviting us to think about all the ways that Toni Morrison was always engaged in trans and interdisciplinary practices and projects. From her founding of the Princeton Atelier, which brings together artists and other kinds of makers in conversation for class, to her own kind of creation of theatrical programs, from Desdemona, which is a musical interpretation of Othello, to Margaret Garner the opera, to her own curatorial labor. So it seemed really organic to me to activate that spirit across campus. So kind of immediately upon being asked to curate it, I reached out to the Princeton Art Museum, who I'd worked with before. I reached out to the McCarter, and Nicole Watson had just joined there as a new associate artistic director. I reached out to Paul Muldoon at the Atelier, and I was like, listen, this is the show that I'm doing. How can we be in collaboration and conversation? And so that's how those partnerships started. And then I knew that I wanted to do a scholarly engagement with it that was also really interdisciplinary, so that's the symposium. I knew I wanted to bring the classroom into it, so I taught 2 classes. So it was a very heavy lift that I have just begun to put down. It was a lot.
Well, it's been really exciting to see it all happening around town. And I know here at the public library, Stephanie had asked us to put up a book display, which we did, and then they all got checked out, and I found more. So I think right now, some came back in over the weekend, because it must have been I think we have the last 10 of our many, many Morrison items. They are on display, and we have wait lists. So it's been really great for our circulation here at the library as well. And it's certainly, all of her books are being checked out, and we have multiple copies of many of them because they're in our book group collection. So it's obviously struck a nerve with the greater town as well, to go back and revisit her works and to talk about them. So, you know, we have multiple copies of many of them because they're in our book group collection. So it's obviously struck a nerve with the greater town as well, to go back and revisit her works and to talk about them. So, you know, we have multiple copies of many of them because they're in our book group collection. So it's obviously struck a nerve with the greater town as well, to go back and revisit her works and to talk about them. So can each of you say, like, if you were somebody just walking into the exhibit, like, what is your hope? And maybe let's pretend this is someone that hasn't read a lot about the exhibit, and as they walk in, what are you hoping that they're going to gain from visiting the exhibit or take away from being there?
The number one down the line.
Sure, I can start. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to approach the exhibit from thinking about Morrison and her creative process. And I think that for creatives, my hope is that they'll see inspiration, but they'll also see a little bit about the intention and the labor and kind of the iterativeness of the process itself. I think one of the things that the exhibit does and does really well is it thinks about the ways in which the works that we have come to know as these masterpieces have gone through multiple iterations before they enter publication. And there's kind of a work and a love and a labor that goes in that, and it's not always already formed. And I hope that that allows other creatives, other writers, other students to have a sense of grace for themselves vis-a-vis their own process. By being able to kind of see the ways in which Morrison herself was working through ideas on the page and doing that in multiple ways.
Well, I would definitely second all that because those books didn't just get birthed in their final format. They were worked over and worked and worked and carefully, honed, and I think that also too we didn't talk very much about the video component.
Oh yeah.
Which is a really, really interesting aspect of the show, and I think that in some ways, when you get, a little too full on looking at the text materials, if you just want to go and sit down and kind of allow that video just to wash over you a little bit, it's really, really interesting. She's sort of freely talking about her creative process in a way that I don't think she does a lot in the same kind of way later on. That feels like a moment where she is still, is that 87? So that's right before Beloved. She's obviously well into it and has had that experience and is very contemplative but sort of freely speaking about what the creative process means to her. And I think that's a really beautiful, in addition to all the other parts, it's a really beautiful section of the show, and one in which I think that you can learn a lot and appreciate what it means to sort of articulate what a creative process is.
I changed my mind. My favorite object is actually the film. I love that film, and I love it for a number of reasons, but it was 8 hours and I edited to 2, and I love it for that reason. I hope that people leave with a sense of trust in themselves to read Toni Morrison's work. Often when I give tours, I always do a poll. What's your familiarity level? Have you read? Have you not read but you know who Toni Morrison is? Or do you not know who she is at all and haven't read? Those are usually the 3 tiers. And often, always, there's a group of people, at least half of the group, that says, I've tried and it's too hard, or I don't think I'm smart enough, or something around there. And I think one of the things that the exhibition does is it gives a number of access points for people to trust themselves to enter the work. And always, by the end, those same people in the group say, I'm going to go back and read X. And so that, for me, is the deepest reward and hope.
I would say that so often I feel like these items are just records of the sort of like ferocity of Morrison's curiosity about language, about her own language, about the world, her world, history, what she was reading, what she wasn't reading. And sometimes I feel like I can join through curiosity. Like if I get curious, it's not that I'm getting curious about something she has the answer to. so much as it's that like I'm meeting whatever curiosity is there on the page. I recently went, my sister visited, and I just like watched her do that thing where she was reading Gia, one of those early stories, and she just was like, again, kept looking at it and knowing less and less and less about it and wanting to stay there more and more and more and more. So yeah, letting things be mysterious, I would say.
Okay, I'm going to go out. Is there any questions from the audience? And this has been such a deep and rich conversation already. Here we have a question.
Yes, the video was amazing, and I did think that was really just, I kept going back to it, and it was fascinating to talk to the guard who listens to it all. Really an interesting perspective. But I wondered about the origin of that. Was that something that just appeared that you found, or was it in the archive, or did someone find it by digging around in the world, or how did that? Because that's just of any artist to have that straightforward conversation for so long, even though it's not as long as it was, as we know. It's really such a gift.
Well, there were AV materials in the collection, and a lot of stuff that was in formats we had no way to look at. And there was some digital project going on, and they said, oh, do you guys want to throw some things in to this digital project? And so we looked through all the AV stuff and pulled out things. I mean, stuff was not really identified great. So I remember thinking, well, this might be interesting, and this might be interesting, and I would be curious to know about this or that. And so I don't know how you finalized that list.
I remember prioritizing things that were pre-1995, because the rest of the material, I did a quick kind of scan, and the rest of it was pretty much available from other libraries or other sources. Mostly the 80s and the early 90s and the 70s stuff. I wanted the earlier stuff that seemed more rare. And then once we got the digitized files back, I remember seeing the title of the Boston Aesthetics Research Project, and that title alone was really interesting to me, and it was from 1987. And then when we got the files back, that was, a lot of them, again, were wonderful, but didn't rise to the level of interesting. And that one, first, the length alone, it was 8 hours. And then once I started digging into the person who, that Boston Aesthetics Research Project, that was a rabbit hole that I went down for like a week. So the psychologist Sigmund Koch is that his first right name? Anyways, it's in this. He was fascinated with the creative mind of artists. So he was really interested in like the neurological workings of the creative's mind. So he interviewed choreographers, visual artists, painters, composers, and 12 total, and Toni Morrison was one of them, over 2 days, 8 hours, and he would bring other people into conversation. So it's him and Toni Morrison, and then Hortense Spillers, and then a professor of English at Boston University comes in. And so that's where that came from, and it was this rare pre-beloved moment where Toni Morrison is really, in part because the post-beloved craze hadn't hit yet, but also because he's a psychologist, so he's able to kind of ask these questions in a way that really invites a different kind of vulnerability, I think, that was rare. And I have seen almost every kind of interview of Toni Morrison, all of the Charlie Rose, all of that stuff. I scoured everywhere. I don't think this had ever been seen before, the show. There is a copy of it at Boston University, but I don't think it's ever been seen publicly.
Hi, so one of the challenges that we have in secondary education is elevating the research skills of the next generation of archivists, creators, and historians. In thinking about Toni Morrison and your challenge to think about juvenilia, never heard that phrase, but I'm thinking about her Nobel speech and the way that she specifically addresses older generations' treatment of younger generations. And I'm wondering, as a high school educator, how do we get more people imagining what an archive is? Whether it's video, when everything happens in a digital world that happens so quickly.
I think you have good thoughts about this.
I think it's interesting. I think it's also fraught in our profession more broadly, because I think that there is this notion that all things can be archives, but there is a specific intervention vis-a-vis long-term perpetuity that archives necessitate. So this comes up a lot in some of the work that I do with community-based archives, wherein folks will use a platform like Facebook as an archive. And we'll think about that as an archival space. But that's proprietary software and can disappear. And so some of the ways that I've been talking about and thinking about this archive doesn't lean into things like Facebook, but also thinks about how we can replicate some of the infrastructure that universities and libraries and special collections might be able to have on community levels, such that people are creating their own archives. I mean, the truth is, you know, your grandmother's papers in her box in her basement are themselves an archive. But there's a certain kind of intervention that's necessary to make sure that in generations from now, they continue to exist, that the people in those photographs can be identified, that they can continue to tell the kinds of stories and capture the kinds of histories and legacies that we hope that they will. I think in terms of like working with young people, part of that might be finding ways to think about the past as present, by highlighting the ways that they themselves are either implicated in or represented in archival spaces, right? So thinking about the ways in which historical changes that can be documented in the archive impact the way that they move about the world right now. And part of that is, I think, a bit of storytelling, which is, I think, perhaps why with this exhibit in particular, I find that it does seem to resonate with younger people who can see themselves reflected back in the story that it's trying to tell, especially as you're thinking about Morrison pre-Beloved. There are snippets of Morrison pre-Bluest Eye. There are these moments of becoming that you can kind of map through. And so, yeah, I think it's a really tricky question, but I think interestingly the field is trying to reckon with it in a way that can unmoor some of the traditional notions that keep it at this exclusionary space.
I also think just like having young people in special collections or in the archives. The first time that I just have always been obsessed with history, but when I was in 6th grade, I went to a history camp, which, yes, they existed, and we received, as part of our study of a particular time period, we would always receive a real census record of somebody who lived during that time period, and we had to imagine what the daily life of that person would have been like and kept a journal. We also went to amusement parks and did other fun things. But for me, I began to see what an archival record could open up in terms of the imagination, and that camp probably had 25 kids a week. At least one, I'm sure there are others, but I am at least one, ran with that, right? And so there was something about that experience on the ground that made me also think that all these records should always be available to me, and I think that's not something that's intuitive to kids. So just having them, performing, touching them, working with them, engaging in creative activities with them, having them a part of learning but also play, I think is really key and demystifies. And I'd be curious to see what the other 24, my sister was there, she does not do archival research, but there were 23 others to be accounted for. That museum's not there anymore, they did the
I'll also note that an accompanying exhibit to Morrison is the
That's
Books
right.
exhibit,
Right.
which is thinking about the co-authored works that Toni Morrison and Slade Morrison did. And so in some ways that's creating an entry point for younger audiences to think about Morrison and Morrison's work, and that includes archival material outside of the physical books themselves. So.
Yeah, and all of those books are checked out of our library too. All of the picture books.
This is like also a call to get more books in this library. I'm hearing. Double duty.
Well, we have copies of them all. They're just very popular right now. Are there other questions? Other questions from the audience? I mean, we're coming up on our hour-long conversation. It's just about perfect. I want to thank everybody for being here, and I want to especially thank our great panelists for this conversation. And if you have friends that wanted to be here tonight, couldn't make it, we will be putting this up on our YouTube channel, and so other people can watch it. But most importantly, if you have yet to see the exhibit, it closes June 4th. Soon. You got about 5-6 weeks left to make yourself you get over there. And maybe if you already have seen it, I think I'm going to go back and visit again, because I think I'm going to look at it with different and fresh eyes after this conversation. I'm going to be looking for some of these favorite objects that you mentioned. And I must admit, I didn't have time to spend with the video when I was there, so I'm going to make sure I carve out some time to... I watched it briefly, but I was just there for a quick walkthrough, so I need to have some more time. So thank you so much to everybody. This was just fantastic. And we hope to see everybody here back at the library for your next big exhibit, whichever that might be.
Oh.
Do you know what it is, Jennifer?
I do.
Oh, I knew what it was. Okay.
Yes, in the fall we'll be opening an exhibit called In the Company of Good Books from Shakespeare and Morrison,
Ooh.
which will be thinking about the long array of English literature, going from Shakespeare's First Folio all the way through Morrison and beyond, thinking about kind of English literature, love of reading, readership, and publishing more broadly.
So that actually does sound like a good crossover program here for a library. So we'll be in contact, Jennifer. And thank you all so much again. And goodbye to our followers on YouTube. Thank you.